Hey everyone, it's Dr. A, and in this video we're going to talk about the 3 stages of labor, which include the dilation, expulsion, and placental stages. Now, right before we continue our exploration of gestation or pregnancy, let's look at a timeline of events that represent a summary of the first, second, and third trimester. So as we consider the first trimester, it's important to note that by the end of this period, the essential or fundamental components of the body systems have been formed. And let's note here also that at the end of the first 3 months, the fetus may weigh anywhere from about 1 to 2 pounds, although this number is not necessarily fixed. And it's within the second trimester that we of course will see noticeable growth of the fetus and continued development. So notice that overall, the change in the size of the fetus as we consider month 4, which is week 16, month 5, which is week 20, and week 24, which is month 6. And as we make our way to the third trimester, the organ systems for the fetus are fully functional at this point. And it's here that the fetus typically weighs anywhere from about 7 to 8 pounds on average. Now, one of the things most intriguing about the gestation and/or pregnancy period is the demand and/or responsibility on the mother's body. In order to pull off this arduous 9-month process, the developing fetus relies upon the mother's internal organs and/or systems for its nourishment, for oxygen, and for waste removal. In essence, when mothers say that they're eating for 2, they're right. They truly are taking care of not only themselves, but their unborn child as well. And in order for the mother to handle this process well, her body has to undergo some adaptations, especially as the fetus continues to grow throughout the gestational period. Now, some of these changes include the following. An increase in the size of the uterus, which makes room for the growing fetus. Increased cellular activity within the mammary glands, preparing for the production of milk so that the mother has the opportunity to breastfeed her child. Increased intake of oxygen, increased volume of blood to not only supply the mother, but the fetus as well, and increased demand for additional nutrients to, of course, provide some of those to the unborn child, along with an increased ability to eliminate waste from the body. And this is traditionally seen through the mother's increased need and/or sensation to urinate. Now, one of the most interesting things to consider as we explore the stages of labor is how this process is initiated. Now, admittedly, this process involves a number of components, but in short, research suggests that the initiation of labor and/or delivery begins with the fetus. Now, specifically, what we're noting here is that the pituitary gland within the fetus releases the hormone oxytocin, and it's the release of this hormone that makes its way to the mother's bloodstream, which interacts with a host of other hormonal changes that is said to kickstart the labor process. Now, one of the things I'd like to put before you is the more anatomically correct term for us to use when we discuss labor. And that term is parturition. And this term literally means the forcible expulsion of the fetus from the uterus. Now, what helps this process along all the more is the initiation of contractions. And it's important to note here that these contractions stem from the uterus and ultimately push the fetus closer to the cervix. So in total, there are set stages of labor, and depending on the text or resource that you reference, you may hear that there are 3 or 4 stages of labor. But within our time together, we'll discuss the process of labor as occurring in 3 unique stages, which include the dilation stage, expulsion stage, and the placental stage. Now, the dilation stage is variable in terms of the amount of time that this period lasts, with it traditionally being at least about 8 hours in time. And of note, it's in this stage that the uterine contractions occur once every 10 to 30 minutes. And if you're a TV or a movie buff, you'll commonly hear nurses and doctors pose the question and saying, how far along are the contractions? And this is partly because knowing how frequently the contractions are occurring can help give them an idea of where an expecting mother is in terms of the delivery process. Additionally, this stage is usually accompanied by an expectant mother saying, "My water broke." And if you're like me, I had been curious for a while about what this meant or what was taking place. Because, of course, quite literally, we don't traditionally think about water breaking. So if we take a look at the picture that we have here, let's identify some of the structures that are shown. First, the entirety of this picture represents the uterus, or what we refer to as the womb. It's the home in which the fetus or baby resides. Next, we have the placenta, followed by the umbilical cord. We also have the cervix and the vagina. Now, essentially, what is taking place here is that the amniotic cavity, or sac, ruptures. And keep in mind that this amniotic cavity contains amniotic fluid. And with that, its initial role or function is, or was, to provide support and protection to the fetus. Now from here, the amniotic fluid leaks through the cervix and then ultimately out of the vagina. Now, in our second stage of parturition, the cervix begins to open due to the descending fetus, and this process continues until the fetus is expelled from the vagina. And this process may take about 2 hours or even less. So notice in the picture here the steps involved in the expulsion stage. First, the head is presented. Then this is accompanied by rotation and delivery of the anterior shoulder, followed by delivery of the posterior shoulder, and finally the lower body and umbilical cord. And one thing to note too, we usually will reserve the term or phrase delivery or birth for when the embryo has become fully exposed to the outside world. Now, one of the things we need to consider is that there may be some challenges that the fetus encounters either prior to or during the expulsion stage, and that may be due to a vaginal canal that's too small. And if that is indeed the case, a procedure known as an episiotomy may be performed. Now, this procedure is essentially a surgical incision of the perineum musculature shown here. And there are two common procedures that are performed. One is a midline incision, and the other is a mediolateral incision. And regardless of the procedure utilized, the goal is to create a widened area to allow for delivery of the fetus. And after a procedure like this, the perineum is sutured to allow for healing of this area. And also, if there are still challenges that present themselves in the delivery process, specifically in the dilation and or expulsion phases, another option is for a cesarean section, also known as a C-section. And this surgical procedure involves making an incision along the abdominal wall and the uterus just large enough to allow for a passageway of the infant's head. And now we've made our way to the final stage of the labor process, which is the placental stage. And you may oftentimes hear about this stage being referred to as the afterbirth. And quite naturally, this is because the placenta is ejected after the birth of the child. Now, in total, this process is said to typically occur within an hour after birth, and its ejection is assisted by uterine contractions. And so in the picture shown here, you can see the ejected placenta. And one of the things we may be alarmed about is the amount of blood that is released during this final stage of labor. But the good news is that the changes we mentioned earlier in regards to the mother's body is that there is a higher volume of blood present. And so the loss of blood that we see here is not something that we have to be alarmed about. So now that we've covered the 3 stages of delivery, let's talk about some of the other things you may hear about as it relates to this process. So specifically, of those things, one might be the giving of birth prematurely. And this is just simply a way to denote that a birth occurred prior to the completion of normal development. And usually, depending upon the weight of the child, with heavier being better and them being further along in the process being better, there's an increased chance of survival. And another thing we have to consider here as well is multiple births. And when we refer to multiple births, we're specifically talking about things like having twins or even triplets. Now, in terms of twins, we have 2 types that you may be familiar with. We have identical twins, and we also have fraternal twins. Now, identical twins are really just that. They are identical. They look exactly alike. And the more appropriate anatomical way for us to refer to them is as monozygotic twins. And this term simply means of one zygote. Now, the way that this works is we have one sperm that penetrates a secondary oocyte, and that ultimately becomes a zygote. And what happens next is not completely known to scientists and researchers, but it splits. That zygote splits, and we end up having 2 different individuals that extend from the same or the one zygote. So in this scenario, we'll always either have 2 identical twin girls or 2 identical twin boys because they both have the same genetic information. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have fraternal twins. And the way this works is by there being 2 separate sperm. And each of these have different genetic information, shown here by the different colors that you see. And what happens is that the mother hyperovulates and produces 2 secondary oocytes. And these 2 secondary oocytes are fertilized by one of each of the sperm shown here. And this produces 2 zygotes, hence the name dizygotic, meaning of 2 zygotes. And from here, we have the early formulation of 2 unique individuals who are really no more different than siblings born at separate times. And what's unique here is that the combination of twins can either be 2 boys, 2 girls, or a girl and a boy. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful, and if you indeed found value in it, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.